Ever since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, numerous Western think tanks, media outlets, and leaders have confidently proclaimed that Russia's economy was on the verge of collapse. Then US President Joe Biden, for example, famously claimed in March 2022 that as a result of the US's unprecedented sanctions, the ruble had been reduced to rubble and that the Russian economy was on track to be cut in half. Within a couple of weeks, however, the ruble had rebounded to its previous level, continued to grow, and by 2025 had become one of the strongest performing currencies in the world. Meanwhile, when adjusted for purchasing power parity between 2022 and 25, Russia's GDP grew to become the fourth largest in the world. But the good times may be over again. Now, in mid-2025, the clamoring that Russia is on the brink of collapse is reaching fever pitch again, sparked in no small part by the economic indicators and warnings from Russian leaders themselves. Let's take a closer look at what's going on and whether Ukraine and its Western backers are finally on the verge of driving Russia into economic collapse, or whether the reverse is true and it's actually Ukraine that's teetering on the edge of an economic abyss. Halfway through the fourth year of the war, all but the most die-hard Ukrainian supporters have accepted that it's hard to see how Ukraine achieves a purely military victory over Russia from here. On the front lines, the war has become a grinding war of attrition, where the primary objective is not so much the capture of territory as the steady degradation of the other side's forces and equipment. In such a war, the odds naturally favor the side with the greater resources, whose advantage widens the longer the war grinds on. So, despite the severe losses in personnel, weaponry, and other equipment it's suffered to date, Russia still holds an overwhelming numerical advantage in most aspects, from manpower and weapons stockpiles to production capacity. As a result, the front lines have been moving steadily westward since early 2024 and at an increasing rate. But the front lines are not the only place that this war of attrition is being fought. Two other fronts are unfolding simultaneously, and they're just as important to the overall result. The second front is a war of long-range drone and missile strikes by both nations deep behind the front lines. These strikes target military infrastructure and logistics, but have also increasingly targeted economic infrastructure. In particular, both sides have been targeting energy infrastructure like oil refineries, key economic logistics like bridges, railways, airports, and important industrial facilities. As we'll see a little later on, in this long-range war of attrition, Ukraine is undoubtedly hurting Russia, both militarily and financially. That ties directly into the third front in this war of attrition, the economic war. The basic objective is the same: grind the other side down until they no longer have the capacity to wage war. Here, Russia again holds a great advantage over Ukraine in terms of revenues, reserves, and resources. However, this economic war of attrition is not being fought just between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has enjoyed massive support from the US, the EU, the UK, and others, both in terms of direct financial aid and the unprecedented 16,000-plus sanctions that these states have imposed on Russia. And in an economic war of attrition, it's Ukraine and its partners that ultimately have the deeper pockets and thus should eventually prevail. So if you look at all three fronts combined, a very different picture emerges. Russia might hold the advantage on the front lines, but in both the economic and long-range strike fronts, Ukraine and its partners have achieved much greater success in grinding Russia down. Indeed, in many ways, Ukraine's future seems to have come down to whether Russia can be ground down economically before it grinds Ukraine down militarily. If Russia is unable to continue funding its war in Ukraine, it will surely have to back off, which would represent a victory for Ukraine and, at a minimum, give it a much stronger hand in the post-war engagements to follow. However, the longer the Russian economy can withstand the building pressure, the more those arrangements are likely to be a bitter pill for Ukraine and its partners to swallow. The stakes couldn't be higher. So with all three wars of attrition seemingly coming to a head at the same time, which way will the cookie crumble? We'll take a look at how the Russian economy is swaying in the wind like a national flag on a KIA's tombstone in a minute. But let's take a quick look at how Ukraine's economy is holding up over 1,000 days into the war. As it is for Russia, if Ukraine is unable to continue funding its war effort, it will likely have to sue for peace on unfavorable terms. The stark truth is that foreign aid is keeping Ukraine's economy afloat. In 2022, following the shock of Russia's invasion, Ukraine's GDP shrank by 28.8%, although it grew by 5.3% in 2023 and 2.9% in 2024, and it's predicted to grow at between 3 and 4.7% in 2025. GDP is still some 20% down from pre-war levels. Moreover, from a population of roughly 42 million in 2021, Ukraine has lost roughly 13 million in 2025. That includes 8 million who are refugees abroad, and around 5 million in the Russian-occupied territories who have, for the most part, already been naturalized as Russian citizens. As you can imagine, the scale of the loss of workforce, enterprise, and economic activity, added to the damage caused by many thousands of Russian missile and drone strikes, has left Ukraine needing to show the same kind of resilience economically as it has on the battlefield. But it's fair to say that without the $118 billion in direct financial aid and loans that have been provided to Ukraine by its partners already, its economy would have collapsed under the weight of the war effort. According to Ukraine's Center for Economic Strategy, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, all of Ukraine's own state budget revenues have been used to finance defense, accounting for approximately half of the state budget. All civilian expenditures of the state budget are financed by foreign financial assistance. In 2024, the need for such external financing is $38 billion. Public sector salaries, including those of the government and social support programs, are now sustained in part by the US and EU through the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration (ERA) mechanism. This program channels profits from frozen Russian assets into loans for Ukraine, meaning that, ironically, Moscow is helping pay the very civil servants working to resist its invasion. However, given the US's evolving relationship with Russia and the legal questions about this process, it's far from ideal for Ukraine to be reliant on a funding source that may stop at any point in order to pay its bills. Besides, as Ukraine discovered when it was pressed into signing a resource agreement with Washington, foreign aid rarely comes without strings attached. Although the final deal confirmed that full ownership and control of the resources would remain with Ukraine, the episode highlighted just how much leverage its allies can exert in times of crisis. But what choice did it have? To its credit, after the first year of the war, when it did resort to printing money, the Ukrainian central bank has largely resisted the easy option of monetizing the deficit, even as inflation has raged between 14% and 27%. As has been witnessed all over the world in the aftermath of the massive global money printing spree to cover the costs of the COVID-19 lockdowns, the price of excess money printing is even higher inflation. Instead, most of the deficit after foreign aid has been applied has been covered by borrowing. Here, Ukraine is likely to find it increasingly difficult to raise cheap financing as a result of defaulting on its repayment obligations on several occasions. In August 2024, the Ukrainian government placed a moratorium on debt repayments, so further defaults and credit agency downgrades are likely. The bottom line is that so long as Ukraine keeps receiving massive backing in terms of finance, let alone crucial weapons like air defense systems and artillery shells, it can probably keep the war effort going until it runs out of able bodies to fight. But that might be easier said than done. Ukraine's shortage of military manpower is well documented. Of the estimated 250,000 recruits added to the Ukrainian armed forces in 2025, 120,000, almost half, are officially listed as deserted. Even with sufficient financing and weaponry secured, Ukraine may still have to make an unsavory choice that it has so far fiercely resisted in order to stay in the war. That is, it may have to start mobilizing 18 to 25-year-olds who have so far been exempt. So that's Ukraine's economy, resilient, resourceful, but deeply dependent on less than watertight arrangements and thus very vulnerable. Now let's take a look at how the Russian economy is holding up, or not. How close to the brink of collapse have Ukraine and its partners brought it? Like Ukraine, the initial effects of the war took a huge toll on the Russian economy. In the aftermath of the US's initial round of comprehensive sanctions in March 2022, the value of the ruble plummeted from around 100 rubles to the dollar to over 138. Hundreds of major Western companies pulled out of the Russian market, and many thousands more stopped exports due to the sanctions. That caused supply shocks in multiple industries, fueling rampant inflation. When Putin announced the mobilization in September 2022, roughly 1 million Russians fled the country, most highly skilled workers from the major cities. That led to an acute labor shortage, especially in high-skilled workers, causing a drop in productivity and rising wages, further fueling inflation. Russia's unemployment rate dropped to a record 2%, illustrating the scale of the labor squeeze. By early 2023, with Ukraine having successfully counterattacked and forced Russia to retreat from Kyiv, Kharkiv Oblast, and parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia, the writing seemed to be on the wall for the Russian war effort. Putin responded by turning Russia's economy into a war economy, imposing harsh capital controls to stop the massive flows of capital leaving the country, and seeking to replace the lost trade with the West in other parts of the world. And to a large extent, by the end of 2024, these efforts seem to have been effective. In stark contrast to Biden's prediction that the Russian economy was on its way to being cut in half, Russia's GDP only dropped by 2.1% in 2022, but grew by 4.1% in both 2023 and 24. In 2022, the average Russian wage dropped by 1.1% but grew by 7.6% in 2023 and 8.8% in 2024 to reach around 100,000 rubles per month, around $1,100. The ruble briefly strengthened after the invasion, moving from pre-war levels of around 75 to 80 to the dollar to below 70 at certain points, before later weakening again. Russia also managed to offset much of the effect of sanctions by redirecting much of its trade to non-Western actors, particularly China, India, and other members of the BRICS group. The shelves in Russian supermarkets remain full of goods, even sanctioned Western products like American chocolate and French wines, albeit significantly more expensive than they were before the war. And crucially, Russia's exports of oil and gas, its primary source of revenue to fund the war, have kept flowing. In some cases, such as India, Russian oil and gas have been bought at a discount, then repackaged and shipped to sanctioning nations. Internally, the switch in the war economy has created tens of thousands of jobs in the military-industrial complex, not to mention hundreds of thousands of recruits into the military. To attract both military workers and soldiers, the state and companies have been offering high wages, often double the average wage at $2,000 to $3,000 per month. Many of these workers and soldiers come from poorer regions and cities, where the inflow of wages has raised living standards and increased consumption. On one hand, that's been a positive social development for millions of people. On the other hand, it's added to the already severe inflationary pressures. Indeed, as evidenced by soaring inflation in 2023 and 24, the major risk to Russia's economy as a result of the war was seen as an excessive overheating of the economy. To cool it down, Russian central bank governor Elvira Nabiullina raised interest rates to a whopping 21%. This has been relatively effective as an inflation control measure, with inflation now reportedly down to around 10%, at least officially. All things considered, on the basis of these headline indicators, despite pumping roughly 40% of state revenues into the war machine, Russia's economy has remained much more resilient than had been anticipated. It would not have been able to continue the war with the same intensity otherwise. But as history shows, war economies are not sustainable in the long run, and by mid-2025, serious cracks have begun to show. You don't have to take our word for it, the warnings come from the likes of Nabiullina herself. Speaking at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in June, she warned that the country can no longer rely on the same tools that sustained growth in the first 2 years of the full-scale war against Ukraine. "We grew for the first 2 years at a fairly high pace because free resources were activated," she said. "We need to understand that many of those resources have truly been exhausted." At the same event, Russian Economy Minister Maxim Reshetnikov stated that Russia's economy is now on the verge of a transition to recession, underscoring the economic slowdown currently underway. GDP growth is anticipated to drop to around 1.4% in 2025, with negative growth predicted for 2026. In and of itself, an economic cooldown after a period of strong growth is not necessarily a bad thing, and many economists would argue is actually a necessary step to ensure long-term sustainability. Even being in a recession or hovering near a recession is not necessarily a sign that a crisis is about to unfold. Germany, for example, has been hovering around the recession line with stagnant or negative growth for several years, but no one sees that as a sign that its economy is about to collapse. However, there are plenty of other signs that the Russian economy is tilting in the wind, notably in the banking sector. For well over 3 years, banks have been propped up by artificial means, tight capital controls, state-directed lending, and regulatory cover-ups. To keep up with inflation and the other pressures of living in a war economy, Russians have been compelled to take on ever-increasing amounts of debt, which at 20% interest quickly takes its toll. Officially, overdue loans reached 10.5% of household debt and 4% of business debt in Q1 2025, although those figures are likely to be substantially higher. This rising tide of bad loans isn't just eroding ordinary Russians' finances, with 58% of Russians in a recent poll saying that inflation was their biggest concern. It's also eroding bank balance sheets. At least 3 of Russia's 13 systemically important large banks are reportedly already in quiet talks with the central bank for bailouts to stay afloat. Even one major bank failure could trigger a wider financial crisis like Lehman Brothers in 2008, and the collapse of 3 would be catastrophic. As a result of this snowballing default growth, credit has collapsed, with demand for new loans drying up. Banks are caught in the squeeze, lending volumes are down, profits are plunging, and capital buffers are thinning. A large part of the problem is the punitively high interest rates. On the one hand, evidence suggests they've been an effective tool at protecting the ruble, although the strong ruble decreases the competitiveness of Russian exports. High interest rates encourage savings, leading to a record 61 trillion rubles, around $750 billion in savings at Russian banks. However, they also discourage investment in industrial and commercial enterprises, complicating Russia's efforts to grow its economic output in the face of unprecedented sanctions, as evidenced by slowing industrial output and growing loan defaults. On the surface of it, Russia has dealt with sanctions fairly effectively to date, replacing much of its former trade with the West, with increased trade with China, India, and other countries in the so-called Global South. Ultimately, Russia is not nearly as dependent on exports as other major economies, with its dependence rate of 21.9%, roughly half the average of 40.7%. However, the sanctions-evading measures, such as importing critical components via back channels at up to 10 times the normal cost and relying heavily on China and a shadow fleet of sanction-evading oil tankers to keep trade alive, have come with their own hidden costs. These include a more inefficient economy, higher transaction costs, and the possible permanent loss of many Western markets. Moreover, the latest round of sanctions targeting its hydrocarbon industry, plus Trump's threat of 100% tariffs for countries buying Russian oil and gas, seem to be biting harder than any that came before. That's in part due to falling oil prices, coupled with the strong ruble. Some 40% of Russia's state revenues come from hydrocarbon exports, and for every $10 drop in global oil prices, Russia's budget revenue is cut by about $17 billion, around 0.8% of GDP. As a direct consequence, Russia's planned 0.5% of GDP deficit in 2025 has been revised to around 1.7% of GDP, similar to 2024's gap. To plug these holes, the government has been tapping its sovereign wealth fund. The fund's liquid assets have fallen below 4 trillion rubles, around $50 billion, which is about the size of this year's budget shortfall. In other words, Russia can only cover at most one more year of deficits at the current war spending rate before its piggy bank is empty. It faces the unsavory choices of printing more money at the risk of even higher inflation, imposing austerity measures, far from ideal during a war, or increased external borrowing. In this regard, Russia has some room to maneuver with a debt-to-GDP ratio of around 20%, an enviable amount when you consider Western nations. The US currently sits at around 121%, having just hit $37 trillion total debt. The UK is at just over 101%, France is at 111.6%, and Germany is at 63.7%. The problem is knowing where to borrow from. Frozen out of the SWIFT financial system and unable to take new loans from the IMF and World Bank, it's left with organizations like the BRICS New Development Bank, which have much more constrained resources and whose primary purpose isn't to bail out its primary members. Meanwhile, Ukraine is ramping up this financial crisis with its increasing strikes on Russia's energy facilities. In the first 10 days of August alone, a drone strike on Rosneft's Novokuyabishevsk refinery in the Samara region damaged its main crude unit and put it offline for at least a month. Another strike hit Rosneft's Ryazan refinery near Moscow, wrecking 2 distillation units and forcing a roughly 60% cut in its August crude intake. And on August 7th, a drone attack ignited a blaze at the Afipsky refinery in Krasnodar, a plant that handles 6.25 million tons of oil per year, around 2% of Russia's refining output. These strikes are hurting Russia's ability to export hydrocarbons to keep funding the war and keep the economy afloat. Some estimates put the damage at over $700 million by late 2024, and that has increased substantially since. Perhaps more importantly, Russia has been forced to stop exports of most gasoline products as a result. That's because these strikes are also heavily impacting domestic energy supplies, particularly to key regions like Moscow, Crimea, and the front lines. The strikes, nicknamed Budanov's sanctions, have caused gasoline prices at the pump to skyrocket near record levels of close to $3 per gallon. Fully aware of the negative economic and societal ripple effects of rising gas prices, Putin finds himself juggling an uncomfortable dilemma: protect wartime oil revenues or keep domestic fuel prices in check. Thus far, he's chosen to prioritize stability at home by curbing exports and eating the cost. That's simply not sustainable indefinitely, a sure sign that Ukraine's tactics are biting. Add it all up, and it's clear that the next couple of weeks or months are going to be crucial for the economic and military prospects of both sides. It's too soon to conclude that either is on the verge of collapse, but both are heading that way exponentially, with factors largely beyond their control limiting their ability to respond. Time will tell which side, if any, succumbs to the pressure first, but whatever happens, make sure you're subscribed to the channel to get the full story as it happens. And thanks for watching.